Meet Ellie, a self-proclaimed full-time Bible nerd who is doing her PhD at Cambridge, and not just any PhD.
I happen to be doing a PhD in Job.
Now, when most people decide to memorize a portion of the Bible, they normally start with a psalm or a Pauline epistle. Ellie, however, decided not just to study Job, but also to memorize it, and not in English.
I don't have the ESV in my head, I have the Hebrew text in my head.
In this conversation, Ellie explains not just her reasoning for taking on such a task, but also some of the incredible insights she's gleaned in the process.
In its literary structure is to increase the reader's sense of longing and desperation for God's voice to enter.
My name's Josh, this is Bible Memory Goal, and today we're diving into the book of Job.
I happen to be doing a PhD in Job. However, I feel more like Job chose me rather than me choosing Job. So to be fair, I did submit a proposal in the book of Job. So that was my doing. But I began admittedly as a very reluctant student of the book of Job, as in I did not have any clear sense of what exactly this book is doing, how to even make out the Hebrew of it, let alone sort of fit together all of the literary parts and the different voices in the book. And so I was thoroughly intimidated at the prospect of wrestling with this text for 3 years. But then as I began to wrestle, even just with my own disposition toward the book, I felt quite convicted that my posture was wrong. That if I was feeling intimidated, that just meant that I was ignorant, not that the text was deficient. And so what if I reframe my perspective to say, actually, if my doctrine of Scripture is such that all of God's word is his gift to his people, and the Spirit is capable of speaking a penetrating word to the church today through the Scriptures, well, that certainly doesn't leave the book of Job excluded. And so why don't I just then approach this as a humble, curious student, ask the Lord to teach me, put the text inside of me, pray, and see what happens. And so I do often refer to it as sort of an embodied doctrine of Scripture experiment. I was like, okay, Ellie, you just have some learning to do. So let's tackle your ignorance rather than assuming that this won't be worthwhile. Start with the opposite assumption that it is, and then find out why. Yeah.
I mean, everybody that I've spoken with, like leading into this interview with you, which has been really exciting for me. Like I tell them, oh, I'm talking to this lady who is, who memorized the book of Job. And even my son, right, 12-year-old son, he goes, Dad, isn't that the most boring book of the Bible? And I was like, son, it gets better because she didn't memorize it in English. Am I right?
Right.
Okay, so
I don't have the ESV in my head, I have the Hebrew text in my head.
You have the Hebrew text of the book of Job in your head. Okay.
Yeah.
So now I have to ask again, explain yourself.
Yes, another valid question. Yeah, essentially, it was another place where I was just registering that the book of Job is hard, and precisely because it's hard, I ought to go about it in the hard way. So the book of Job has Hebrew that's notoriously some of the most difficult in the Old Testament. I mean, there's a high concentration of Hebrew words that only occur once in Job, or even just very rarely in the Old Testament. So, and the syntax can be quite challenging. So basically I thought, well, I know that English translators are doing their ardent best, but sometimes they're kind of punting to figure out what on earth a given line means. So rather than putting an English version in my head and always wondering what Hebrew is underlying it, I may as well just go right to the source, put the Hebrew in me, and then, and then work out some of the other issues from there.
Now, I'm assuming that you've studied Hebrew, so this isn't just like you're learning and you don't even know what you're saying. Like there's actually meaning.
Yes. Now, I will say, though, I was more committed to sort of my rate of memorization than I was to perfect comprehension at every turn. So there would be a time, for instance, at which I would get to a line and I would look down and think, I currently know about 2 or 3 of those words. Well, in it goes, and then you just, actually, as I went, I felt that I had this exhilarating experience of discovering more and more brilliance in the artistry of the Hebrew text, because your brain is just hungry to latch onto any bits of material that will aid in order and in storage. So in some respects, as I went, I was like, dang, I think this is maybe a bit easier to memorize in Hebrew. Obviously, not actually because I'm a native English speaker.
Yeah.
But the Hebrew does have all sorts of these witty literary devices. It's really brilliantly constructed. That was actually quite helpful in
Yeah.
memorization. Um,
So
yeah,
I do want to spend a period of time towards the end of this asking about your process.
yeah,
But I am just fascinated by this idea of, what you learn in the process of memorization, and not just in the process of memorization, but now looking into the original texts. I know this is like an open can of worms here, but can you share at least a couple things that God at least really brought to the forefront as you're going through the book of Job in this way?
yeah, yeah. Oh, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. I always would say that if I came out of my PhD untransformed, I've done something very wrong. Like this ought to be something that is a matter for, yeah, my own seeking of the Lord and growing in faith before I would dare to open my mouth or use my fingers to type anything about it. So it was, yeah, certainly high profile for me as I was going through this process. And I think one of the sort of macro level effects of memorizing the whole book is that every single word feels costly when you're memorizing, which very quickly presses the question, why on earth is the book so long? Particularly because you have these dialogue cycles in the middle that as the reader can just feel bewildering because these characters are alternating and you're trying to figure out, are they saying different things from each other? I think I've heard that already, several times before. Why are they still going on? Yeah, what's the literary effect of this? And as I, yeah, carried through this process, it takes just as long to memorize 10 verses of Eliphaz's speech as it does 10 verses of God's speech. And it takes you 37 chapters to get to the entry of the divine voice. And so, yeah, I just am quite convinced at this point that one of the intentions of the construction of Job in its literary structure is to increase the reader's sense of longing and desperation for God's voice to enter. Like, I think you're supposed to find it confusing. You're supposed to find it hard, actually, to get through all of Job. So, your son's impression, everyone,
Yeah.
like, it's one of the most widespread impressions of the
Yeah.
book of Job is why on earth can I not just skip chapters 3 to 37? Um, that's what everyone instinctively wants to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's part of preparing you for the divine voice because you just register that the best human attempts possible to provide an answer for Job's dilemma have come up, yeah, just very glaringly short. You actually watch the dialogue devolve and the answers disintegrate, and Job is not resolved. And then you have this building sense of like we desperately need the divine voice to enter into the conversation, and God does. And one of the yeah, if the scriptures teach anything, man, they teach a God who answers. Like it's just the consistent witness of the scriptures. God doesn't always answer in the time you think he ought to, in the way you think he ought to. Job's questions were certainly reframed, but God does answer, and therein lies resolution for Job. So that was, yeah, I think one, as I say, kind of macro level observation. Another was just, oh, I know I'm only catching a mere fraction of the brilliance of the text. Even so, though, just picking up on uh, lexical, so word repetitions throughout the text, the
Yeah.
riffing of themes throughout the text. Just once you have the text inside of you, you're quicker to see things
Yes.
as they recur in other places, but now they've been set in a new context. And so, actually, yeah, the sense of them is different. And that, man, has a whole host of literary implications depending on who's saying what when. Um, there's sort of this tiering of perspectives in Job where you as the reader are set up with a kind of omniscience because you've read the prologue, right? And obviously all the characters within the book are living inside of the narrative and they don't have this sort of bird's eye view of the narrator. Um, yeah, so then you're just picking up on things. If you've read the prologue carefully, you're picking up things in the dialogues that the characters are saying unwittingly, and yeah, it's really clever, and I think is actually quite conducive to meditation. Like you do just need to go over it and over it and over it, and as you steep yourself in it, you start to see more, to ask different questions. Um, So that's been something else I've enjoyed. Yeah.
Did you notice at all any difference in even the Hebrew text when you moved from the people, the dialogue that's happening in the first 36 chapters and then to the divine voice? Like, is there a difference in the way that that is written out?
Okay, I'm going to give you one of my very subjective impressions from memorizing.
Okay. Okay.
So let's just take Elihu. So he's the fourth interlocutor who joins Job in chapters 32 to 37. And he's
Okay.
always a mystifying character because he's not evaluated by God or the narrator at any place. So he tends to be quite polarizing. Either you love him or you hate him. You think, oh, he's basically says the same thing as God does in the divine whirlwind speeches. So he doesn't need rebuke like the friends do. Or you
Okay.
say he's so rubbish that God just blows right past him and ignores him and gets on with it. I tend to be more in the latter camp, certainly saying that Elihu has a legitimate literary role in the book, but I think he has more negative characterization. And my one of my really subjective impressions is that when I got to chapter 32, I had been memorizing Job in Hebrew for a while. So, like, my capacity to retain new material and learn new verses had developed at this point. But
Yeah.
man, it was hard to get Elihu in my head. Even still, now that I'm quite familiar with the text and I go over 7 chapters a day, so every week I have the whole book going through my head. Even
Yeah.
still, Elihu is the speaker that will make me slow down the most because it just doesn't feel as as apparent what the organization is, and my brain's looking for order
Yeah.
to be able to, kind of progress and store material. And then when I hit the divine whirlwind speeches, I just started clipping. Now,
Really.
it could be partially that the end was in sight, and so I was just ready. At that point,
Yeah.
I'm memorizing like 8 to 10 new verses a day, so I was moving.
Wow.
But it did feel to me like, oh, I can totally track with, the direction. It's very possible to put this into subsections of text, and I just
Yeah.
ate it up, which to me felt like quite a glaring contrast with the experience I just had in
With
Elihu.
Elihu.
Um,
Yeah.
Another cool thing that I'll just mention quickly with the Divine Whirlwind speeches is I'm quite convinced that if you've read the text carefully, especially in Hebrew, but hopefully if you have a good English translation, you could pick it up there too. I think you're meant to get the sense that God's been listening. So he uses
Mm.
this language and imagery that's been surfacing earlier in the dialogues. And so I think when you get to God's answering, one of the sort of implicit undertones of the speeches is that even though God's been silent for 37 chapters, he's not been absent. That a silent
Mm.
heaven doesn't mean an absentee heaven. That actually God's been listening all along and he answers in a way that simultaneously doesn't let Job set the terms of the encounter and yet is still a genuine engagement with
Mm.
what's been said beforehand. Um, which, I just found to be deeply profound and very pastorally relevant.
Yeah.
In terms of this sense that God's been listening. And Job even said in chapter 9, if I called and he answered me, I don't believe that he'd be listening to my voice. And
Mm.
already, from the time God begins to answer, Job must know, oh, but God
He
has been
was.
listening. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So well said. Yeah. When it comes to your what I would maybe call theology of suffering or theology of pain, how have you transformed from the beginning of this project to the end of this project?
Yeah, yeah. Firstly, I should say that one of the reasons I felt quite intimidated about doing a PhD in Job is my youth alone. Like, I just am
Mm.
conscious that, I'm quite young and there are a lot of life experiences, good and bad, especially thinking with regard to Job of experiences of suffering that I've not had yet. Obviously, no one has an entirely um,
Yeah.
straightforward, sufferingless life. However, that has just, given me great pause. I want to be very careful before I opine on suffering, if I've learned anything from the book. I think one of the chief insights that I would offer to people and have if I've been teaching or preaching the book is that there's a difference in being a God who answers a sufferer and being a human who answers a sufferer. And I actually take it as as a moral imperative from the book of Job to intercede, to be one who chiefly speaks to God about another, even more than to another about God. I see that as the grounds actually of God's rebuke to the three friends in the epilogue. Not that you haven't said correct things about me like Job has, but actually you've not spoken to me reliably like Job has. And actually, if you go back, you realize, oh, Job has engaged in the second person address of God. His consistent orientation has been towards encounter with God for as much brash speech as he utters, as much as he does need some reorienting and rebuke in the divine whirlwind speeches. He's been pressing to God. Whereas the friends have had a lot to say about God and about the way God governs the world and its implications for Job. And yet, as I see it, they've failed to ally with him as an intercessor. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's been one of the chief ways that I've sought to grow as I, yeah, look at people around me and a suffering world around me. Like, what's my role in that? Uh,
Yeah.
Principally, I think to pray and to take that as a really serious injunction, yeah, from the scriptures.
I
So,
think that's such a powerful picture of what you just said, where it's like, as opposed to talking to others about God, it's talking to God about others. That
yeah.
is so well said. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
I feel like I could ask you a million questions about your experience with Job, but I think what I'd like to do now is really just transition to the kind of the practical.
Mm.
Uh, what did it take for you? First of all, how long did it take for you to memorize the entire book of Job?
Yeah, it took me a little less than 6 months. So,
That is unbelievable, by the way. I think, I don't know, I was expecting like the word years to come out of your mouth, but no, six
no,
months.
no. So my rationale was that anyone could, lots of people would want to, and I get to, so I ought to. So it was just like, let's go for it. And really, it's just a combination of discipline and enthusiasm, I think.
Hmm.
Um, so I have never done any memorization project of this scale before. So I didn't go in
Okay.
with a very clear sense of game plan. And as I said, my rate of new verses added definitely increased over time. So
Okay.
I started at a place or I ended at a place different from where I began. But yeah, generally my rhythm. So I guess first thing to know is that I'm a particularly visual learner. So I knew if I want something to stick in my brain, I need to look at it. Lots of people would
Okay.
say, do you listen to the text? Are you just always having it in your headphones? No, I actually didn't do that at all. Maybe could have
Hmm.
benefited from doing it more, but for me, it was just relentless repetition after looking at the text. So I'm an early riser. So once I had some chapters under my belt, from pretty early in the morning, oftentimes right after my alarm went off, Job would start rolling. And so I would go over more secure material, several chapters. Oftentimes it was in the maybe 7 to 10 range, number of chapters I'd go over in my head before I even arrived to the library. Um,
Can I stop you for just a second and
yeah.
let you know, like that to me, and I've done this for a long time, but even that is, I'm just impressed. By the way, like I don't know if I can say that that's normal. That is very crazy. So kudos. Like I want anybody who maybe is watching or listening to this to know that may not be normal for a lot of people.
Which is, yeah, very fair, very fair. I Yeah, I should also say oftentimes that was happening in conjunction with exercise. And so I do find if my body is
Yeah,
moving, that really helps my brain
yeah.
just kind of wake up and actually get into rhythm. Um, but I mean, once it's in your head, you can take it on the street. There are definitely some scenarios where I
Yeah.
register that it's more difficult. I mean, especially if you're doing it entirely in your head, it's quite easy for your mind to wander. And it's just so much material. I mean, 42 chapters of Hebrew is a good bit to hold in your brain and try to store. But I was just so determined that I wouldn't let anything slip as I gained new material. So I would just be relentless in going over new material until I was absolutely certain that it wouldn't disappear if I did it every other day. And then I go over every other day until I was absolutely certain I can get away with every 3 days. And it won't go. So I had this by the end, I had this second level of memory, which was trying to remember which chapters I had done yesterday and where I was up to today, because I had several sets of rotations that I was working through. So I wasn't going through the text sequentially at that point. I'd do a chunk here, a chunk here, a chunk here. And then in the library, kind of my freshest time of the day, right in the morning, I would pace. I'd look at the text, say it, okay, pace, keep saying it. And so it was just a lot of that repetition.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you say visual, you literally mean looking at the words as opposed to you're not necessarily making pictures out of the words or anything like that. It's just you would be looking at the words and then repeating it in your head.
Yep, yep. I
Okay.
would just look, and I made sure that I kept the same window. So I have Bible software that I was looking at the Hebrew text on, and I would keep the window at the same width. And so even I think just having one key thing for me was to break a given chapter into sections. So as I'm going over material, I'm thinking, okay, I'm on this section of say 7 verses. And within that, it's divided into 2 lines or 3 lines based on maybe there's the same Hebrew conjunction that begins these 3 lines. Or maybe there's a word at the end of this line that the root repeats, somewhere in the second line. Maybe the content of these couple lines is related. And so I just had to be really consistent with those blocks of material to try to give my brain as much order as possible to go on.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And then you
So
just,
I want to end with this question for you. If you're, for anybody that is listening right now or watching this and they're thinking to themselves, oh, I'm in the midst of James right now, or like, what would you say in terms of maybe even memorization, like any encouragement for that? But even I think just this idea of memorizing something hard
mm,
because there's value in doing that. Like, have you
yeah.
found like, oh, this maybe it's okay to memorize a couple chapters of a book that you wouldn't normally think is one that we memorize. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I guess my general and first thought that comes to mind is that what a joy it is that we get to have eyes that are trustingly curious. Like if we
Mm,
have a high view of scripture, then we just get to go in on the assumption this will be worth it. And I may not see that immediately. It may not be exactly what I anticipated. It doesn't mean it won't feel grueling at some points. Like your brain is just so tired and you feel like you're just forcing new material in. But
yeah.
that's okay. Like you obviously don't need to, yeah, the goal is not to get to the point where you just feel this is utter drudgery, and I'm languishing. No,
Yeah.
certainly not. But do persevere and and work as well on praying your way to eyes that are trustingly curious. I think that's been, yeah, that's one of the phrases that just remains in my head, even from the book of Job in terms of what it teaches. Like it poses this question: Are you willing to trust God's wisdom? Uh,
Yeah.
and in some ways, yeah, I've had to grapple with that question a bit, even as I've just approached this task. Um, yeah, do I trust that the God who speaks in the scriptures continues to answer? And am I ready to hear his voice? Do I want to hear his voice? And that will be, yeah, hard work oftentimes to wait until chapter 38, to actually persevere through the whole book. So that would be the main thing. And then yeah, I think also just being sober minded about what needs to give and what needs to be carved out in life, like what space and time you actually need to
Mm,
carry out a given memorization goal. Like it just will be demanding depending on what you've set out to do. And so, yeah, I guess being realistic and thoughtful about where are the actual blocks in the day that I can give time to this,
yeah.
and what is it going to take to maintain this material too, especially if that matters to
Yeah.
someone. Um, so yeah, but otherwise, just discipline and enthusiasm, really. It's a joy.
Which you seem to have in abundance. That's amazing. I love it.
Oh, I've come across so many people who just, when they see my smile and know that I'm working in Job, they have this deep skepticism. Like, there's no way those things go together. Certainly the latter militates against the former. But Job and joy, it's real, I think.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ellie Weiner. If you want to read more of what she's written about this book of Job and everything she's been studying, I'll leave links to some of the articles that she's done online. And speaking of memorizing harder portions of the Bible, I have this interview with Dr. Andy Davis where he talks about his process of memorizing the book of Ezekiel and how difficult and challenging that was for him. Don't shy away from the hard parts of the Bible, because I believe there's so many things that God has in store for us when we dive into those deep places and wrestle with the text and wrestle with God. May the Lord bless you as you continue to memorize what matters.